was certain they were still out there. Small hope that Melonville had decided to obey his orders at this late juncture. Choosing the man just because he had the grace to be embarrassed by Wyriman's behavior had been a mistake. But there had been little time to make a choice, and he had had to get rid of Wyriman. Nothing to be done about it now. Maybe one of the Kyrianen could be put in command. If even his direct order would make the Tyrants follow a Kyrianen. A milling mass right at the city's high gray wall caught his eye. Tall, iron-bound gates stood open. Aiel battling horsemen and spearmen almost in the open, while folk tried to close the gates. Tried and failed because of the press of bodies. Horses with empty saddles and armored men unmoving on the ground half a mile from the gate marked where the sortie had been driven back. Arrows rained down from the walls in head-sized chunks of rubble, even occasional spears slashing down, with enough force to spit 2 men or 3, though he still could not see from where exactly. But the Aiel were going over their dead, ever closer to forcing their way in. A quick scan showed him 2 more columns of Aiel trotting toward the gates, perhaps 3,000 all told. He did not doubt that they were Couladins as well. He was aware of grinding his teeth. If the Shaido got inside Cairhien, he would never drive them north. He would have to dig them out street by street. The cost in lives would dwarf the number of those already dead. And the city itself would end to ruin like Ironrod, if not Taion. Kyrianen and Shaido were mingled like ants in a bowl. He had to do something. Taking a deep breath, he channeled. The 2 women had set the conditions, bringing the storm clouds. He did not need to be able to see their weavings to take advantage of them. Stark, silver-blue lightning struck into the Aiel once, twice, again, as fast as a man could clap. Rand jerked his head up, blinking away the burning lines that still seemed to cross his side. When he looked through the long tube again, Shaido looked like cut barley, all around where the bolts had fallen. Men and horses thrashed on the ground closer to the gates, too, and some did not move at all. But the uninjured were dragging the injured, and the gates were beginning to close. How many won't make it back inside? How many of my own did I kill? The cold truth was that it did not matter. It had to be done, and it was done. And well, it was. Distantly, he felt his knees wobbling. He would have to pace himself if he was to last the rest of the day. No more laying about him everywhere. He had to spot where he was particularly needed, where he could make a... The storm clouds were massed only over the city and the hills to the south. But that did not stop lightning from slashing out of the clear, cloudless sky above the tower, flashing down into the gathered maidens below with a deafening crack. Hair lifting with the tingle in the air, Rand stared. He could feel that bolt in another way. Feel the weaving of saidin that had made it. So Asmodean was tempted, even back in the tents. There was no time for thought, though. Like rapid beats on a giant drum, bolt followed bolt, marching through the maidens until the last struck the base of the tower in an explosion of splinters the size of arms and legs. As the tower slowly began to slant over, Rand threw himself at Egwene and Aviendha. Somehow he managed to scoop them both into one arm, then wrapped the other around an upright on what was now the upslope side of the platform. They stared at him wide-eyed, mouths coming open, but there was no more time for speaking than for thinking. The shattered log tower toppled, crashing through the branches of the trees. For an instant, he believed they might cushion the fall. With a snap, the upright he clung to broke off. The ground came up and knocked all the breath out of him, a heartbeat before the women came down on top of him. Darkness rolled in. He regained consciousness slowly. Hearing returned first. It dug us up like a boulder and sent us rolling downhill in the night. It was Aviendha's voice, low, as if she spoke for her own ears. There was something moving on his face. You have taken away what we are, what we were. You must give us something in return, something to be. We need you. The moving voice slowed, touched more softly. I need you. Not for myself, you will understand. For Elaine. What is between her and me now is between her and me. But I will hand you to her. I will. If you die, I will carry your corpse to her. If you die. His eyes popped open, and for a moment they stared at each other, almost nose to nose. Her hair was all in disarray, her headscarf gone, and a pimple marred her cheek. She straightened jerkily, folding a damp cloth stained with blood, and began dabbing at his forehead with considerably more force than before. I have no intention of dying, he told her, though in truth he was not sure of that at all. The Void and Saidin were gone, of course. Just thinking of losing them as he had made him shiver. It was pure luck that Saidin had not scoured his mind blank in that last instant. Just thinking of seizing the source again made him groan. Without the Void for buffer, he felt every ache, every bruise and scrape to the fullest. He was so tired he could have dropped off to sleep at once if he had not hurt so much. As well he did hurt then, because he surely could not sleep. Not for a long time yet. Sliding a hand beneath his coat, he touched his side, then surreptitiously wiped the blood off his fingers onto his shirt before bringing the hand out again. No wonder that a fall like that had broken open a half-healed, never-healed wound. He did not seem to be bleeding too badly, but if the maiden saw it, or Egwene, or even Aviendha, he might have a fight to keep from being hauled off to Moraine for healing. He had too much to do yet for that. Being healed on top of everything else would act on him like a cudgel to the temple. And besides, he must be far worse hurt than what he suffered for her to deal with. Grimacing, suppressing another groan, he got to his feet with only a little help from Aviendha, and promptly forgot about his injuries. Sulin sat on the ground nearby, with Egwene bandaging a bloody split in her scalp and muttering fiercely at herself because she did not know how to heal. But the white-haired maiden was not the only casualty, and not the worst by far. Everywhere, cotton sore-clad women were covering the dead with blankets, tending those who had merely been burned, if merely could be used for lightning burns. Except for Egwene's grumbling, the hilltop lay in near silence. Even the injured women quiet, save for hoarse breathing. The log tower, all but unrecognizable now, had not spared the maidens in its fall, breaking arms and legs, tearing open gashes. He watched as a blanket was laid over the face of a maiden with red gold hair, almost the shade of Elaine's, head twisted at an unnatural angle and glazed eyes staring. Jolene. One of those who first crossed the Dragon Wall to search for He Who Comes with the Dawn. She had gone to the Stone of Tyr for him, and now she was dead for him. Oh, you've done well in keeping the maidens from harm, he thought bitterly. Very well indeed. He could still feel the lightning, or rather the residue of its making. Almost like the afterimage burned into his eyes earlier, he could trace the weave, though it was fading. To his surprise, it led west, not back toward the tents. Not Asmodean, then. Samael. He was sure of it. Samael had sent that attack on the Jangai. Samael was behind the pirates and the raids in Tyr. Samael had done this. His lips peeled back in a snarl, and his voice was a harsh whisper. Samael. He did not realize he had taken a step until Aviendha seized his arm. A moment later, Egwene had the other, the pair of them clinging to him as if they meant to root him to the spot. Do not be a complete bullhead, Egwene said, giving a start at his glare, but not letting go. She had redone the brown scarf around her head, but combing with her fingers had not put her hair back in order, and dust still covered her blouse and skirt. Whoever did this, why do you think he waited so long, until you must be tired? Because if he missed killing you, and you went after him, it would be easy meat. You can barely stand on your own. Aviendha was no readier to let go, meeting his stare with a flat one of her own. You are needed here, Randolphor. Here, Karakarn. Does your honor lie with killing this man, or here with those you have brought to this land? A young Aielman came running out through the maidens, shufa around his shoulders, spears and bucklers swinging easily. If he thought it odd to find two women holding land between them, he gave no hint of it. He eyed the shattered remnants of the tower, and the dead and wounded with a slight curiosity, as though wondering how it might have happened and where the enemy dead might be. Grounding his spear points in front of Rand, he said, "I am Siren, of the Sharara sept of the Tomanel." "I see you, Siren," Rand replied just as formally. Not easy with a pair of women holding him as if they thought he might run. "Han of the Tomanel sends word to the Kha Khan. The clans to the east are moving toward each other. All four. He means to join with Derek, and he has sent to Aram to join them." Rand drew a measured breath and hoped the women thought his grimace was for the news. His side burned, and you could feel blood spreading slowly down his shirt. So there would be nothing to force Couladin north when the shadow broke. If they broke, they had given no evidence of it yet that he had seen. Why were the Miyagoma and the others joining together? If they meant to come against him, they were only giving warning. But if they meant to come against him, Han and Derek and Aram would be outnumbered. And if the shadow held long enough, and the four clans broke through. Across the wooded hills, he could see that it had begun to rain over the city, now that Egwene and Aviendha were not holding the clouds. That would hamper both sides. Unless the women were in better shape than they looked, they might be unable to regain control from this distance. Tell Han to do what he must to keep them off our backs. Young as he was about Rand's age, come to that. Siren raised an eyebrow in surprise. Of course, Han would not do differently, and Siren knew it. He waited only long enough to make certain that Rand had no further message. Then he was off and running downhill just as fast as he had come. No doubt he hoped to get back without missing any more of the fighting than he had to. For that matter, it might already have begun there to the east. "I need someone to fetch Jian," Rand said as soon as Siren had dashed off. If he tried to walk that far, he really would need the women to hold him up. The two of them looked nothing alike, yet they managed practically identical suspicion. Those violence must have been one of the things every girl was taught by her mother. "I'm not going after Samael. Not yet. I have to get closer to the city, though." He nodded to the fallen tower. That was the only gesture available with them hanging on. Master Torvier might be able to salvage the lenses from the looking glasses, but there were not 3 logs of the tower unbroken. No more observing everything from on high today. Egwene was plainly uncertain, but Aviendha barely paused before asking a young maiden to go to the Gaishan. To fetch mist, too, which he had not counted on. Egwene began brushing herself off, muttering under her breath at the dust, and Aviendha had found an ivory comb and another scarf somewhere. Despite the fall, somehow they already looked considerably less disheveled than he. Weariness still marked their faces, but as long as they could channel at all, it would be useful. That gave him pause. Did he ever think of anyone now except as how useful they were? He should be able to keep them as safe as they had been atop the tower. Not that the tower had been very safe, as it turned out. But this time he would manage things better. Sulan stood as he approached, a pale cap of Algota bandage covering the top of her head, her hair a white fringe below. "I'm moving nearer the city," he told her, "where I can see what is happening, and maybe do something about it. Everyone who is injured is to remain here, along with enough others to protect them if need be. Make it a strong guard, Sulan. I only need a handful with me. And it's poor repayment for the honor the maidens have shown me if I let their wounded be slaughtered. That should hold the greater part of them away from the fighting. He himself would have to stay clear to keep the rest out, but the way he felt, there would be no burden. I want you to stay here, and I am not one of the injured," she said stiffly. And he hesitated, then nodded slowly. Very well. He had no doubt that her injury was serious, but neither did he doubt that she was tough. And if she stayed, he might be stuck with someone like Anila leading his guard. Being treated like a brother was nowhere near as annoying as being treated like a son, and he was in no mood to put up with the latter. But I trust you to see that no one follows who is injured, Sulan. I will have to keep moving. I can't afford anyone who will slow me down or must be left behind." She nodded so quickly that he was convinced she would make any maiden with as much as a scratch remain behind. Except herself, of course. This was one time he felt no guilt over using someone. The maidens had chosen to carry the spear, but they had chosen to follow him too. Maybe follow was not precisely the word, considering some of the things they did, but that did not change anything to his mind. He would not, he could not, order a woman to her death, and that was that. In truth, he had expected some sort of protest before this. He was only grateful that it did not come. I must be more subtle than I think. Two pale-robed Daishain arrived, leading Jotun and Mist, and behind them followed a crowd of others, arms full of bandages and ointments, and over their shoulders, bulging water bags in layers, under the direction of Sorilea and a dozen other wise ones whom he had met. At most, he thought he might know the names of half. Sorilea was very definitely in charge, and she quickly had Daishain and other wise ones alike, circulating among the maidens tending wounds. She eyed Rand and Egwene and Aviendha, frowning thoughtfully and pursing her lips, obviously thinking that all three looked tossed about enough to need their injuries bathed. That look was enough to send Egwene scrambling into the Grey's saddle with a smile and a nod for the aged wise one. Though if Aiel had been more familiar with riding, Sorilea would have realized that Egwene's awkward stiffness was not usual. And it was a measure of Aviendha's condition that she let Egwene pull her up behind the saddle without the slightest protest. She smiled at Sorilea too. Gritting his teeth, Rand pulled himself into his own saddle in one smooth motion. Aching muscles' protests were buried under an avalanche of pain in his side, as though he had been stabbed anew, and it took a full minute before he could breathe again. But he let none of it show. Egwene reined Mist close to Jotun, near enough to whisper, "If you cannot mount a horse any better than that, Randolph Thor, maybe you should forget about riding at all for a while." Aviendha wore one of those blank Aiel expressions, but her eyes were intent on his face. "I noticed you mounting too," he said quietly. "Maybe you ought to stay here and help Sorilea until you feel better." That shut her up, even if it did tighten her mouth sourly. Aviendha gave Sorilea another smile. The old wise one was still watching. Rand booted the dapple to a trot downhill. Every step sent a jolt up his side that had him breathing through his teeth. But he had ground to cover, and he could not do it at a walk. Besides, Sorilea's stare had been starting to get on his nerves. Mist joined Jotun before he was 50 paces down the overgrown slope, and another 50 brought Sulin and a stream of maidens, some running to position themselves ahead. More than he had hoped for, but it should not matter. What he had to do would not involve getting very close to the fighting. They could stay back in safety with him. Seizing saidin was an effort in and of itself, even through the Angreal, and the sheer weight of it seemed to press down on him greater than ever, the taint stronger. At least the void shielded him from his own pain. Somewhat, anyway. And if Samael tried to play games with him again... He quickened Jotun's pace. Whatever Samael did, he still had his own job to do. Rain dripped from the brim of Matt's hat, and periodically he had to lower his looking glass and wipe off the end of the tube. The downpour had slackened in the last hour, but the sparse branches overhead gave no shelter at all. His coat was long since soaked, and Pips's ears were down. The horse stood, as if not intending to move however Matt thumped his heels. He did not know for sure what time of day it was. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, he thought. But the dark clouds had not thinned along with the rain, and they hid the sun where he was. On the other hand, it felt very much like 3 or 4 days since he had ridden down to warn the Tyrants. He was still not sure why he had done that. It was southward that he peered, and a way out that he looked for. A way out for 3,000 men. Easily that many survived yet, though they had no idea what he was up to. They believed he was hunting another fight for them. But 3 so far were 3 too many by his book. He thought he could have escaped on his own now, so long as he kept his eyes open and his wits about him. 3,000 men, however, drew eyes wherever they moved, and they did not move quickly, but with more than half their number afoot. That was why he was on this light-forsaken hilltop, and why the Tyrans and Carianan were all jammed into the long, narrow hollow between this hill and the next. If he simply made a break for it. Jamming the looking glass back to his eye, he glared south at sparsely wooded hills. Here and there were thickets, some fairly large, but most of the land was scrub or grass even here. He had worked back to the east, using every fold in the ground that would hide a mouse, bringing the column with him out of the treeless terrain and into some poplar cover. Out of those bloody lightning strikes and fireballs. He was not sure whether it was worse when they came, or when the earth simply erupted in a roar for no apparent reason. All that effort to find that the battle was shifting with him. He could not seem to get out of the center of the thing. Where's my bloody luck now that I really need it? He was a pea-brained fool for staying. Just because he had managed to keep the others alive this long did not mean he could keep it up. Soon or late, the dice would come up the Dark One's eyes. They're the flaming soldiers. I should leave them to it and ride. But he kept searching, scanning the wooded peaks and ridges. They gave cover for Couladin Zail as well as for him. But here and there he could make them out. Not all were involved in pitched battles, but every last group was larger than his. Every one was between him and safety to the south, and he had no way to tell who was who until it might be too late. The Aiel themselves seemed to know at a glance, but that did him no good. Some mile or more off, a few hundred cotton-soil-clad shapes, running 8 abreast and heading east, topped a rise where half a dozen leatherleaf made a poor excuse for a copse. Before the lead runners could start down the other side, a lightning bolt flashed down into their midst, splashing men and earth like a stone thrown into a pond. Pips did not even quiver as the clap reached Matt. The gelding had grown accustomed to closer strikes than that. Some of the fallen men picked themselves up, limping, and immediately joined those who had kept their feet in a hasty check of the unmoving. No more than a dozen were hauled across shoulders before they all dashed down from the height, back the way they had come. None paused to look at the crater. Matt had watched them learn that lesson. Waiting only invited a second silvery lance from the clouds. In moments, they were out of sight, except for the dead. He swung the looking glass east. There was a look of sunlight a few miles that way. The log tower should have been visible, poking above the trees, but he had not been able to find it in some time. Maybe he was looking in the wrong places. It did not matter. The lightning had to be Rand's work, and all the rest of it as well. If I could get far enough that way. He would be right back where he started. Even if it was not the pull of ta'veren drawing him back, he would have a hard time leaving again once Moraine found out. And there was Melindra to consider. He had never heard of a woman who would not take it askance when a man tried to walk out of her life without letting her know. As he panned the looking glass slowly, hunting the tower, a slope covered in spaced leather leaf and paper bark abruptly went up in flames. Every tree became a torch at the same instant. Slowly he lowered the brass-bound tube. He hardly required it to see the fire, and the thick gray smoke already making a thick plume into the sky. He did not need signs to recognize channeling when he saw it, not like that. Had Rand finally tipped over the edge of madness? Or maybe Aviendha had finally had enough of being forced to stay around him. Never upset a woman who could channel. That was a rule Matt seldom managed to follow, but he did try. Save the smart mouth for somebody besides yourself, he thought sourly. He was just trying not to think about the third alternative. If Rand had not finally gone mad, and Aviendha or Egwene, or one of the wise ones, had not decided to be rid of him, then someone else was taking a hand in the day's business. He could add 2 twos without getting 5. Samael. So much for trying that way out. It was no way out of anything. Blood and bloody ashes. What has happened to my... A fallen branch cracked under someone's foot behind him. He reacted without thinking, knees more than reins pulling Pips in a tight circle, sword-bladed spear whipping across from the pommel of his saddle. Estienne almost dropped his helmet, his eyes going wide, as the short blade stopped a breath short of splitting his head for him. The rain had slicked his hair down into his face. Also afoot, Melicion grinned, partly startled and partly amused at the other young tyrant's discomfort. Square-faced and blocky, Melicion was the second since Villanreal to lead the tyrant cavalry. Talmanes and Derrid were there as well, a pace behind as usual, and blank-faced beneath their bell-shaped helmets, also as usual. Before it left their horses farther back in the trees. "There are you coming straight for us, Matt," Melicion said as Matt raised the raven-marked spear upright. "The light bring my soul if there's one less than 5,000. He grinned at that, too. "I don't think they know we're here waiting for them." Estienne nodded once. "They are keeping to the valleys and hollows, hiding from..." He glanced at the clouds and shivered. He was not the only one to be uneasy about what might come out of the sky. The other three looked up too. "Anyway, it's plain they mean to go through where Derrid's men are." There was actually a touch of respect in his voice when he mentioned the pikes. Grudging, true, and not very strong, but it was difficult to look down on someone after they had saved your neck a few times. "They will be on top of us before they see us." "Wonderful," Matt breathed. "That is just bloody wonderful."
Hey, Rug Zombie, how you
He meant it
doing?
for sarcasm, yet
Cheers to you too.
Estienne
I'm about to
of course.
smoke
They
one
looked eager. But Derrid wore as much expression on his scarred face as
or
a
two.
rock, and Talmanes lifted an eyebrow at Matt just a fraction, shook his head a hair. That pair knew fighting. The first encounter with the Shido had been an even wager at best, one Matt would never have taken if not forced. That all the lightning had shaken the Aiel enough to turn it into a rout changed nothing. Twice more today they had seen action, when Matt discovered himself in a choice of whether to catch or be caught, and neither had come out nearly as well as the tyrants believed. One had been a draw, but only because he had been able to lose the Shido after they pulled back to regroup. At least they had not come again while he was getting everyone away through the twisting hill valleys. He suspected they had found something else to occupy them. Maybe more of that lightning, or fireballs, or the light knew what. He knew very well what had allowed them to escape their last fight with skins mostly whole. Another bunch of Aiel plowing into the rear of those fighting him, just in time to keep the pikes from being overrun. The Shido had decided to withdraw to the north, and the others, he still did not know who, had swung off to the west, leaving him in possession of the field. Melicion and Estienne considered it a clear victory. Derrid and Talmanes knew better. "How long?" Matt asked. It was Talmanes who answered. "Half an hour, perhaps a little more, if grace favors us." The Tyrants looked doubtful. They still did not seem to realize how quickly Aiel could move. Matt had no such illusions. He had already studied the surrounding terrain. But he looked at it again and sighed. There was a very good view from this hill, and the only halfway decent stand of trees within half a mile was right where he sat his saddle. The rest was scrub brush, little as much as waist high, dotted with leatherleaf and paper bark and the occasional oak. Those Aiel would surely send scouts up here for a look, and there was no chance at all that even the horsemen could get out of sight before they did.
I'll be right back.
The pikes would be right out in the open. He knew what had to be done. It was catch or be caught again. But he did not have to like it. He only took a glance, but before he could open his mouth, Derrid said, "My scouts tell me Couladin himself is with this lot. At least their leader has his arms bare and shows marks such as the Lord Dragon is said to carry." Matt grunted. Couladin, and heading east. If there was any way to step aside, the fellow would run headlong into Rand. That might even be what he was after. Matt realized that he was smoldering, and it had nothing to do with Couladin wanting to kill Rand. The Shido chief, or whatever the man was, might remember Matt vaguely as somebody hanging about Rand. But Couladin was the reason he was stuck out here in the middle of a battle, trying to stay alive, wondering whether any minute it was going to turn into a personal fight between Rand and Samael. The kind of fight that might kill everything within 2 or 3 miles. That's if I don't get a spear through the brisket first. And no more choice about it than had a goose hanging outside the kitchen door. None of it would be so. Pity no one had killed the man years ago. He certainly gave excuses enough. Aiel seldom let anger show, and when they did, it was cold and tight. Couladin, on the other hand, seemed to flare up 2 or 3 times a day, losing his head in a fiery rage as quick as snap a straw. A miracle he was still alive, and the Dark One's own luck. Elysion, Mat said angrily, swing your tyrants wide to the north and come in on these fellows from behind. We will be holding their attention, so you ride hard and come down like a barn collapsing. So he has the Dark One's luck, does he? Blood and ashes, but I hope mine is back in. Talmanis, you do the same to the south. Move, both of you. We've little time and it's wasting. The 2 tyrants bowed hastily and dashed for their horses, clapping on their helmets. Talmanis's bow was more formal. Grace, favor your sword, Mat. Or perhaps I should say your spear. Then he was gone too. Looking up at Mat as the 3 vanished down the hill, Darad slashed rain from his eyes with a finger. So you will stay with the Pikes this time. You must not let your anger at this Couladin overcome you. A battle is no place to try fighting a duel. Mat barely stopped from gaping. A duel? Him? With Couladin? Was that why Darad thought he was staying with the Foot? He had chosen it because it was safer to be behind the Pikes. That was his reason. The whole reason. Not to worry. I can hold myself in rain. And he had thought Darad the most sensible of the whole lot. The Cairhienin merely nodded. I thought that you could. You have seen Pikes pushed before and faced a charge or 2, I vow. Talmanis gives praises when there are 2 moons. Yet I heard him say aloud that he would follow wherever you led. Someday I would like to hear your story, Anderman. But you are young. Under the light, I mean no disrespect. And young men have hot blood. This rain will keep it cool if nothing else does. Blood and ashes. Were they all mad? Talmanis was praising him? He wondered what they would say if they found out he was only a gambler following bits of memory from men dead 1,000 years and more. They would be drawing lots for first chance to spit him like a pig. The lords especially. No one liked being made to look a fool, but nobles seemed to like it least of all. Perhaps because they so often managed it on their own. Well, one way or another, he meant to be miles away when that discovery came. Bloody Couladin. I'd like to shove my spear down his throat. Healing pips, he started for the opposite slope, where the Foot waited below. Darad climbed into his own saddle and swung in beside him, nodding as Mat spun out his plan. The bowmen on the slopes, where they could cover the flanks, but lying down, hidden in the brush until the last minute. One man on the crest to signal the Aiel in sight, and the Pikes to step off as soon as he did, marching straight out toward the approaching enemy. As soon as we can see the shadow, we'll retreat just as fast as we can, almost back to the gap between these 2 hills, then turn to face them. They will think we wanted to run, realized we could not, and turned at bay like a bear to the hounds. Seeing us less than half their number and fighting only because we must, they should think to roll over us. And we but hold their attention until the horse comes down on them from behind. The Cairhienin actually grinned. It is using the Aiel's own tactics against them. We had better hold their bloody attention. Mat's tone was as dry as he was wet. To make sure we do, to make sure they don't start putting loops around our flanks, I want a cry raised as soon as you stop the retreat. Protect the Lord Dragon. This time, Darad laughed aloud. That should bring the shadow in right enough, especially if Couladin was leading. If Couladin really was leading, if he thought Rand was with the Pikes, if the Pikes could hold until the horse arrived, a lot of ifs. Matt could hear those dice rolling in his head again. This was the biggest gamble he had ever taken in his life. He wondered how long it was until nightfall. A man should be able to make his way out in the night. He wished those dice would get out of his head or else fall, so he knew what they showed. Scowling into the rain, he booted Pips on down the hillside. Jordan stopped on a crest where a dozen trees made a thin topknot, and Rand hunched slightly against the pain in his side. The crescent moon, riding high, cast a pale light, yet even to his Saidin-amplified vision, anything more than 100 paces distant was featureless shadow. Night swallowed the surrounding hills whole, and he was only intermittently aware of Sulan hovering nearby and maidens all around him. But then he could not seem to keep his eyes more than half open. They felt grainy, and he thought the gnawing pain in his side might be all that held him awake. He did not think of it often. Thought was not only distant now, it was slow. Was it twice Samael had attempted his life today, or 3 times? More? It seemed that he should be able to remember how often someone had tried to kill him. No, not to kill, to bait. Are you still so jealous of me, Tel'Jinin? When did I ever slight you, or give you 1 finger less than your due? Swaying, Rand scrubbed a hand through his hair. There had been something odd about that thought, but he could not recall what. Samael? No. He could deal with him when, if, no matter, later. Today, Samael was only a distraction from what was important. He might even be gone. Vaguely it seemed that there had been no attack after what? He recalled countering Samael's last move with something particularly nasty, but he could not pull the memory to the surface. That balefire. Mustn't use that. Threatens the fabric of the pattern. Not even for Ilyena. I would burn the world and use my soul for tinder to hear her laugh again. He was drifting again, away from what was important. However long the sun had gone down, it had sunk on fighting, lengthening shadows gradually overwhelming the golden red light, the men killing and dying. Now, vagrant winds still brought distant shouts and screams. Because of Couladin? True. But at the heart of it, because of himself. For a moment he could not remember his name. Rand al'Thor, he said aloud and shivered, though his coat was damp with sweat. For an instant that name had sounded strange to him. I am Rand al'Thor, and I need to see. He had not eaten since morning, but then the taint on Saidin drove hunger away. The void quivered constantly, and he hung on to the true source by his fingernails. It was like riding a bull driven mad by redwort, or swimming naked in a river of fire, churned to rapids by jagged boulders of ice. Yet when he was not on the brink of being gored or battered or drowned, it seemed that Saidin was the only strength left in him. Saidin was there, filing at the edges of him, trying to erode or corrode his mind, but ready to be used. With a jerky nod he channeled, and something burned high in the sky. Something. A ball of bubbling blue flame that banished shadows in harsh light. Hills mounted up all around, trees black in the stark illumination. Nothing moved. A faint sound came to him on a gust of wind. Cheering, perhaps, or singing. Or maybe he was imagining things. It was so tiny, he could well have been. And it died with the wind. Suddenly he became aware of the maidens around him. Hundreds of them. Some, including Sulan, were staring at him, but many had their eyes squeezed shut. It took him a moment to realize they were trying to preserve night vision. He frowned, searching. Egwene and Aviendha were no longer there. Another long moment passed before he remembered to loose the weave of his channeling and let blackness reclaim the night. A deep blackness to his eyes now. Where are they? He was vaguely irritated when he had to say who he meant, and just as vaguely aware that he had no reason for it. They went to Moraine Sedai and the Wise Ones at dusk, Karakan, Sulin replied, moving closer to Jotun. Her short white hair shone in the moonlight. No, her head was bandaged. How could he have forgotten? A good 2 hours gone. They know that flesh is not stone. Even the strongest legs can run only so far. Rand frowned. Legs. They had been riding mist. The woman was making no sense. I have to find them. They are with Moraine Sedai and the Wise Ones, Ka'akarn, she said slowly. He thought she was frowning, too, but it was hard to be sure. Not them, he muttered. I have to find my people. They're still out there, Sulin. Why was the stallion not moving? Can you hear them? Out there in the night, still fighting. I need to help them. Of course. He had to dig his heels into the Dapple's ribs, but when he did, Jotun only shifted sideways, with Sulin holding on to his bridle. He did not remember that she had been holding the bridle. The Wise Ones must speak to you now, Rand al'Thor. Her voice had changed, but he was too weary to say how. Can't it wait? He must have missed the runner with the message. I must find them, Sulin. And Nyla seemed to spring up on the other side of the stallion's head. You have found your people, Rand al'Thor. The Wise Ones are waiting for you, Sulin added. She and Nyla turned Jotun without waiting on his agreement. Maidens crowded in for some reason as they started along a winding way down the side of the hill, faces reflecting moonlight as they stared up at him, so close their shoulders brushed the horse's flanks. Whatever they want, he grumbled, they had best be quick. There was no need for them to be leading the Dapple, but there was too much effort to make a fuss over it. He twisted to look back, grunting at the pain in his side. The crest was already swallowed in the night. I have a lot to do yet. I need to find Couladin, Samael. The men who are fighting and dying for him. I need to find them. He was so tired, but he could not sleep yet. Lamps on poles lit the Wise Ones' encampment, and small fires where kettles of water were hauled away and replaced by white-robed men and women as soon as they began boiling. Gashine scurried everywhere, and Wise Ones as well, tending the wounded whose numbers swelled the camp. Moraine was moving slowly down the long lines of those who could not stand, only rarely pausing to lay hands on Aiel, who then thrashed in the throes of being healed. She swayed whenever she straightened, and Lan hovered behind her, as if wanting to hold her up, or expecting to have to. Sulin exchanged words with Adolin and Nyla, too low for Rand to make out, and the younger women ran to speak to the Aes Sedai. Despite the numbers of wounded, not all of the Wise Ones were looking after them. Inside a pavilion off to one side, perhaps 20 sat in a circle listening to one standing in the center. When she sat, another took her place. Gashine knelt around the outside of the pavilion, but none of the Wise Ones appeared to have any interest in wine, or anything except what they were hearing. Rand thought the speaker was Amis. To his surprise, Asmodean was also helping out with the wounded, the water bag hanging from each shoulder, looking decidedly odd with his dark velvet coat and white lace. Straightening from giving a drink to a man stripped to the waist except for bandages, he saw Rand and hesitated. After a moment, he handed the water bags to one of the Gashine and wove his way through the maidens toward Rand. They ignored him. They all seemed to be watching Adolin and Nyla speaking to Moraine, or else eyeing Rand. And his face was tight by the time he had to pause for the solid circle of Father Eyes Mai around Jotun. They were slow in parting, and did so just enough to let him through to Rand's stirrup. I was sure you must be safe. I was sure. From his tone of voice, he had been no such thing. When Rand did not speak, Asmodean shrugged uncomfortably. Moraine insisted I carry water. A forceful woman to not allow the Lord Dragon's barb to... Trailing off, he licked his lips quickly. What happened? Samael, Rand said, but not in answer. He was just speaking the thoughts that drifted through the void. I remember when he was first named Destroyer of Hope, after he betrayed the gates of Havan and carried the shadow down into the Ron Medoy and the heart of Satel. Hope did seem to die that day. Kulan Kuhan wept. What is wrong? Asmodean's face had gone as white as Sulan's hair. He only shook his head mutely. Rand peered at the pavilion. Whoever was speaking now, he did not know her. Is that why they are waiting for me? Then I should join them. They will not welcome you yet, Lan said, appearing beside Asmodean, who jumped. Or any man. Rand had not heard or seen the warder approach either, but he only turned his head. Even that seemed an effort. It seemed to be someone else's head. They meet with the wise ones from the Miagoma, the Kadara, the Shianda, and the Darine. The clans are coming to me, Rand said flatly. But they had waited long enough to make today bloodier. It never happened like that in the stories. So it seems. But the 4 chiefs will not meet you until the wise ones have made their arrangements, Lan added dryly. Come. Moraine can tell you more than I of it. Rand shook his head. Done is done. I can hear details later. If Han doesn't need to keep them from our backs any longer, then I need him. Sulan, send a runner. Han, it is done, Rand, the warder said insistently. All of it. Only a few Shido remain south of the city. Thousands have been taken prisoner, and most of the rest are crossing the Galen. Word would have been sent to you an hour ago, had anyone known where you were. You've kept moving. Come and let Moraine tell you. Done. We won. You have won. Completely. Rand peered at the men being bandaged, the patient lines awaiting bandages, and those leaving with them. The rows that lay almost unmoving. Moraine was still making her way along those, pausing wearily here and there to heal. Only a few of the wounded would be here, of course. They would have been coming as they could throughout the day, leaving as and when they could. If they could. None of the dead would be here. Only a battle lost is sadder than a battle won. He seemed to remember saying that before, long ago. Perhaps he had read it. No. There were too many living in his responsibility for him to worry over the dead. But how many faces will I know like Jolene's? I will never forget Ilyena, not if all the world burns. Frowning, he raised a hand to his head. Those thoughts had seemed to come on top of one another, from different places. He was so tired he could hardly think, but he needed to. Needed thoughts that did not slide by, almost beyond his reach. He released the source in the void and convulsed as Saidin almost drove him under in that moment of retreat. He barely had time to realize his mistake. With the power gone, exhaustion and pain crashed down on him. He was aware of faces turned up to him as he toppled from his saddle. Hands reaching to grab him, cushion his fall. Moraine! Lan shouted, voice hollow in Rand's ears. He is bleeding badly. Sulan had his head cradled in her arms. Hold on, Randall Thor, urgently. Hold on. Asmodean said nothing, but his face was bleak, and Rand felt a trickle of Saidin flowing into him from the man. Darkness came. Chapter 45. After the Storm. Sitting on a small boulder jutting from the foot of the slope, Matt winced as he pulled his broad-brimmed hat lower against the mid-morning sun, partly to shield his eyes from the sun. And there was another thing he did not want to see. The cuts and bruises reminded him, especially the arrow slash along his temple that the hat pressed against. An ointment from Darrett's saddlebags had stopped the bleeding, there and elsewhere. Yet everything still hurt, and most of it stung. That part would grow worse. The heat of the day was just beginning to take hold, but sweat was beating up on his face and already dampening his small clothes and shirt. Idly, he wondered whether autumn would ever come to Cairhien. At least discomfort kept him from thinking how tired he was. Even after a night with no sleep, he would have lain awake in a feather bed, much less blankets on the ground. Not that he wanted to be anywhere near his tent in any case. A fine bloody to-do. Nearly killed. I'm sweating like a pig. I can't find a comfortable place to stretch out. And I don't dare get drunk. Blood and bloody ashes. He stopped fingering a slice across the chest of his coat. An inch difference, and that spear would have gone through his heart. Light, but the man had been good. And put that part of it out of his mind. Not that it was easy, with what was going on all around him. For once, the Tyrants in Cairhien did not seem to mind seeing Aiel tents in every direction. There were even Aiel right in the camp, and almost as miraculously, Tyrants mingling with Cairhien among the smoky cook fires. Not that anyone was eating. The kettles had not been set on the fires, although he could smell meat burning somewhere. Instead, most were as drunk as they could manage on wine, brandy, or Aiel usquai, laughing and celebrating. Not far from where he sat, a dozen defenders of the stone, stripped to sweaty shirt sleeves, were dancing to the claps of 10 times as many watchers. In a line, with arms around each other's shoulders, they stepped so quickly that it was a wonder none of them tripped or kicked the man next to them. For another circle of onlookers, near a 10-foot pole stuck in the ground, Matt hastily averted his eyes. As many Aielmen were doing some kicking of their own. Matt assumed it was a dance. Another Aiel was playing the pipes for them. They leaped as high as they could, flung one foot even higher, then landed on that foot, and immediately leaped upward again, faster and faster, sometimes spinning like horizontal tops at the height of their leaps, or turning somersaults or backflips. 7 or 8 Tyrants in Cairhien sat nursing broken bones from trying it, all the while cheering and laughing like madmen, passing a stone crock of something back and forth. In other places, other men were dancing, and maybe singing. It was hard to say in the din. Without stirring, he could count 10 flutes, not to mention twice as many tin whistles, and a skinny Cairhienan in a ragged coat was blowing something that looked part flute and part horn with some odd bits tossed in. And there were countless drums, most of them pots being banged with spoons. In short, the camp was bedlam and a ball rolled into one. He recognized it, mainly from those memories he could still assign to other men if he concentrated hard enough. A celebration of still being alive. One more time they had walked under the Dark One's nose and survived to tell the tale. One more dance along the razor's edge finished. Almost dead yesterday, maybe dead tomorrow, but alive, gloriously alive today. He did not feel like celebrating. What good was being alive if it meant living in a cage? He shook his head as Darred, Estienne, and a heavy-set red-haired Aielman he did not know staggered by, holding each other up. Barely audible through the clamor, Darred and Estienne were trying to teach the taller man between them the words to Dance with Jack of the Shadows. We'll sing all night and drink all day, and on the girls we'll spend our pay. And when it's gone, then we'll away to dance with Jack of the Shadows. The sun-dark fellow showed no interest in learning, of course. He would not unless they convinced him it was a proper battle hymn. But he listened, and he was not the only one. By the time the 3 passed out of sight in the milling crowd, they had acquired a tale of 20 more, waving dented pewter cups and tarred leather mugs, all bellowing the tune at the top of their lungs. There are some delight in ale and wine, and some in girls with ankles fine. But my delight, yes, always mine, is to dance with Jack of the Shadows. Matt wished he had never taught any of them the song. The teaching had just kept his mind occupied while Dare had stopped him from bleeding to death. That ointment stung as bad as the gashes themselves had, and Darrett would never make a seamstress jealous with his delicate handling of needle and thread. Only the song had spread from that first dozen like fire in dry grass. Tyrants and Carrianan, horse and foot, had all been singing it when they returned at dawn. Returned. Right back to the hill valley where they had started. Below the ruin of the log tower, and no chance for him to get away. He had offered to ride ahead, and Talmanas and Elysion nearly came to blows over who was to provide his escort. Not everyone had become the best of friends. All he needed now was for Moraine to come asking questions about where he had been and why, nattering at him about Taviran and duty, about the pattern and Tom and Gaydon, until his head spun. Doubtless she was with Rand now, but she would get around to him eventually. He glanced up to the hilltop in the tangle of shattered logs among broken trees. That Carrianan fellow who made the looking glasses for Rand was up there with his apprentices poking about. The Aiel had been full of what happened there. It was definitely past time for him to be gone. The Foxhead medallion protected him from women channeling, but he had heard enough from Rand to know a man's channeling was different. He had no interest in finding out whether the thing would shield him from Samael and his ilk. Grimacing at darts of pain, he used the black-hafted spear to lever himself to his feet. Around him the celebration went on. If he drifted down to the picket lines now, he was not looking forward to saddling Pips. The hero should not sit without drinking. Startled, he jerked around, grunting at the stab of his wounds to stare at Melindra. She had a large clay pitcher in one hand, not Spear's, and her face was not veiled, but her eyes seemed to be weighing him. Now listen, Melindra, I can explain everything. What must be explained? She asked, flinging her free arm around his shoulders. Even with the sudden jolt, he tried to stand straighter. He still was not used to having to look up at a woman. I knew you would seek your own honor. The Ka Khan casts a great shadow, but no man wishes to spend his life in the shade. Closing his mouth hurriedly, he managed to faint. Of course. She was not going to try to kill him. That's it exactly. In his relief, he took the pitcher from her, but his gulp turned into a sputter. It was the rawest double-distilled brandy he had ever tasted. She retrieved the pitcher long enough to take a draw, then sighed gratefully and pushed it back at him. He was a man of much honor, Matt Cawthon. Better that you had captured him, but even by killing him, you have gained much G. It was well that you sought him out. Despite himself, Matt looked at what he had been avoiding and shivered. A leather cord tied in short, flame-red hair held Couladin's head atop the 10-foot pole, near where the Aielmen were dancing. The thing seemed to be grinning at him. Sought Couladin out. He had done his best to keep the pikes between him and any of the Shaido. But that arrow had clipped the side of his head, and he was on the ground before he knew it, struggling to get his feet, with the fight raging all around him, laying about him with the raven-marked spear, trying to make it back to Pips. Couladin had appeared as if springing out of air, veiled for killing. But there had been no mistaking those bare arms entwined with dragons, glittering gold and red. The man had been cutting a swath into the pikemen with his spears, shouting for Rand to show himself, shouting that he was the true Ka Khan. Maybe he really believed it by then. Matt still did not know whether Couladin had recognized him, but it made no difference, not when the fellow decided to carve a hole through him to find Rand. He did not know who had cut off Couladin's head afterward, either. I was too busy trying to stay alive to watch, he thought sourly, and hoping he would not bleed to death. Back in the Two Rivers, he had been as fine a hand with the quarterstaff as anyone, and a quarterstaff was not so different from a spear. But Couladin must have been born with the things in his hands. Of course, that skill had not availed the man much in the end. Maybe I still have a little bit of luck. Please, light, let it show itself now. He was thinking of how to get rid of Melindra so he could settle Pips, when Talmanis presented himself with a formal bow, hand to heart in the Carrienan fashion. Grace favor you, Matt. And you, Matt said absently. She was not going to go because he asked. Asking would certainly put a fox in the hen yard. Maybe if he told her he wanted to take a ride. They said Aiel could run down horses. A delegation came from the city during the night. There will be a triumphal procession for the Lord Dragon in gratitude from Carrion. Will there? She had to have duties of some sort. The maidens were always flocking around Rand. Maybe she would be called off for that. Glancing at her, though, he did not think he had better count on it. Her wide smile was proprietary. The delegation was from the High Lord Mylan, Elysion said, joining them. His bow was just as correct, both hands sweeping wide but hasty. It is he who offers the procession to the Lord Dragon. Lord Dobrain, Lord Marin Gill, and Lady Colaver, among others, also came to the Lord Dragon. Matt pulled his mind back to the moment. Each of the pair was trying to pretend the other of them did not exist, both looking right at him, with never the flicker of an eye toward each other. But their faces were as tight as their voices from the strain, their hands white-knuckled on sword hilts. It would be a cap to everything if they came to blows, and him likely still trying to hobble out of reach when one of them ran him through by accident. What does it matter who sent a delegation as long as Rand gets his procession? It matters that you should ask him for our rightful place at the head, Talmanis said quickly. You slew Couladin and earned us that place. Elysion closed his mouth and scowled. Plainly, he had been about to say the same thing. You two ask him, Matt said. It's none of my affair. Melindra's hand tightened on the back of his neck, but he did not care. Moraine would surely not be far from Rand. He was not about to put his neck in a second noose, while still trying to think his way out of the first. Talmanis and Elysion gaped at him as if he were demented. You are our battle leader, Elysion protested. Our general. My body servant will polish your boots, Talmanis put in with a small smile that he carefully did not direct at the square-faced tyrant. And brush and mend your clothes, so you will appear at your best. Elysion gave his oiled beard a jerk. His eyes darted halfway to the other man before he could stop them. If I may offer, I have a good coat I think will fit you well. Gold, satin, and crimson. It was the Carrienan's turn to glower. General, Matt exclaimed, holding himself up with the spear haft. I'm no flaming... I wouldn't want to usurp your place. Let them figure out which one of them he meant. Burn my soul, Elysion said. It was your battle skill that won for us and kept us alive, not to mention your luck. I've heard how you always turn the right card, but it is more than that. I'd follow you if you had never met the Lord Dragon. You are our leader, Talmanis said right on top of him, in a voice more somber, if no less certain. Until yesterday, I have followed men of other lands because I must. You I will follow because I want to. Perhaps you are not a lord in Andor, but here, I say that you are. And I pledge myself your man. Carrienan and Tyron stared at one another as though startled at voicing the same sentiment. Then slowly, reluctantly, exchanged brief nods. If they did not like each other, and only a fool would bet against that, they could meet on this point. After a fashion. I will send my groom to prepare your horse for the procession, Talmanis said, and barely frowned when Elysion added, Mine can share the work. Your mount must do us proud. And burn my soul, we need a banner. Your banner. At that, the Carrienan nodded emphatically. Matt was not sure whether to laugh hysterically or sit down and cry. Those bloody memories. If not for them, he would have ridden on. If not for Rand, he would not have the things. He could trace the steps that led to them, each necessary as it seemed at the time, and seeming an end in itself, yet each leading inevitably to the next. At the beginning of it all lay Rand. And bloody ta'veren. He could not understand why doing something that seemed absolutely necessary and as close to harmless as he could make it always seemed to lead him deeper into the mire. Melindra had begun stroking the back of his neck instead of squeezing it. All he needed now, he glanced up the hill, and there she was. Moraine, on her delicate-stepping white mare, with Lan on his black stallion towering at her side. The warder bent toward her as if to listen, and there seemed to be a brief argument, a violent protest on his part. But after a moment, the Aes Sedai reined Al-Deeb around and rode out of sight toward the opposite slope. Lan remained where he was on Mondarb, watching the camp below, watching Mat. He shivered. Couladin's head really did appear to be grinning at him. He could almost hear the man speak. "You may have killed me, but you've put your foot squarely in the trap. I'm dead, but you'll never be free." "Just bloody wonderful," he muttered, and took a long, choking swallow of the rough brandy. Talmanis and Elysion seemed to think he meant it as said, and Melindra laughed agreement. Some 50 or so Tyrants in Cairhienin had gathered to watch the two lords speak to him, and they took his drinking as a signal to serenade him, beginning with a verse of their own. "He'll toss the dice however they fall, and snuggle the girls, be they short or tall. Then follow young Mat whenever he calls, to dance with Jack of the Shadows." With a wheezing laugh he could not stop, Mat sank back down onto the boulder and set about emptying the pitcher. There had to be some way out of this. There just had to be. Rand's eyes opened slowly, staring up at the roof of his tent. He was naked beneath a single blanket. The absence of pain seemed almost startling. Yet he felt even weaker than he remembered. And he did remember. He had said things, thought things. His skin went cold. I can't let him take control. I am me. Me. Fumbling beneath the blanket, he found the smooth, round scar on his side, tender yet whole. "Moraine Sedai healed you," Aviendha said, and he gave a start. He had not seen her, sitting cross-legged on the layered rugs near the fire pit, sipping from the silver cup worked with leopards. Asmodean lay sprawled across tasseled cushions, chin on his arms. Neither appeared to have slept. Dark circles underlined their eyes. "She should not have had to," Aviendha went on in a cool voice. Tired or not, she had every hair in place, and her neat clothes were a sharp contrast to Asmodean's rumpled dark velvets. Now and then she twisted the ivory bracelet of roses and thorns that he had given her, as if not realizing what she was doing. She wore the silver snowflake necklace, too. She still had not told him who had given it to her, though she had seemed amused when she realized he really wanted to know. She certainly did not look amused now. Moraine Sedai herself was near collapse from feeling wounded. Arna Line had to carry her to her tent. Because of you, Rand al'Thor. Because healing you took the last of her strength. The Aes Sedai is on her feet already, Asmodean put in, stifling a yawn. He ignored Aviendha's pointed stare. She has been here twice since sunrise, though she said you would recover. I think she was not so certain last night. Nor was I. Pulling his gilded harp around in front of him, he fussed with it, speaking in an idle tone. I did what I could for you, of course. My life and fortune are tied to yours. But my talents lie elsewhere than healing, you understand. He strummed a few notes to demonstrate. I understand that a man can kill or gentle himself doing what you did. Strength and the power is useless if the body is exhausted. saidin can kill easily if the body is exhausted. Or so I've heard. Are you finished sharing your wisdom, Jason the Tail? Aviendha's tone was chillier, if anything, and she did not wait for a reply before turning a gaze like blue-green ice back to Rand. The interruption, it seemed, was his fault. A man may behave like a fool sometimes, and little is the worse for it. But a chief must be more than a man, and the chief of chiefs more still. You had no right to push yourself near to death. Egwene and I tried to make you come with us when we grew too tired to continue, but you would not listen. You may be as much stronger than we as Egwene claims, yet you are still flesh. You are the Kara Khan, not a new Sayadun seeking honor. You have to, obligation to the Aiel, Rand al'Thor, and you cannot fulfill it dead. You cannot do everything yourself. For a moment, he could only gape at her. He had barely managed to do anything at all, had left the battle to others for all practical purposes, while he stumbled about trying to be useful. He had not even been able to stop Samael from striking where and as he chose, and she upbraided him for doing too much. "I will try to remember," he said finally. Even so, she looked ready to lecture more. "What news of Miagoma and the other 3 clans?" he asked, as much to divert her as because he wanted to know. Women seldom seemed willing to stop until they had hammered you into the ground, unless you managed to distract them. It worked. She was full of what she knew, of course, and as eager to instruct as to scold. Asmodean's soft strumming, for once something pleasant, even pastoral, made an odd background for her words. The Miagoma, the Shianda, the Derine, and the Kodara were camped within sight of one another, a few miles to the east. A steady stream of men and maidens moved between the camps, including Rand's, but only among societies. And Indirian and the other chiefs were not stirring. There was no doubt now that they would come to Rand eventually, but not until the Wise Ones finished their talks. "They are still talking?" Rand said. "What under the light do they have to discuss that takes so long? The chiefs are coming to follow me, not them." She gave him a flat look that would have done credit to Moraine. "The Wise Ones' words are for wise ones, Rand al'Thor." Hesitating, she added, as if making a concession, "Egwene may tell you something of it when it is done." Her tone implied that Egwene might not, too. She resisted his attempts to learn more, and finally he let it lie. Perhaps he would find out before it bit him, and perhaps not. But either way, he was not going to pry one word out of her that she did not want to speak. Aes Sedai had nothing on Aiel Wise Ones when it came to guarding their secrets and surrounding themselves with mystery. Aviendha was absorbing that particular lesson very well. Egwene's presence at the meeting of Wise Ones came as a surprise, and so did Moraine's absence. You would have expected her to be in the middle, twitching strings to her plans, but it turned out that one grew from the other. The newcome Wise Ones had wanted to meet with one of the Aes Sedai who followed the Khan, and although she was back on her feet after healing him, Moraine claimed to have no time. Egwene had been routed from her blankets as a replacement. That made Aviendha laugh. She had been outside when Soralea and Bear practically dragged Egwene from her tent, trying to pull on her clothes while they hustled her along. I called to her that she would have to dig holes in the ground with her teeth this time if she had been caught in the sleep. She was so sleepy she believed me. She began protesting that she would not, so hard that Soralea began demanding what she had done to think she deserved to. You should have seen Egwene's face. She laughed so hard that she nearly toppled over. Asmodean actually looked at her askance, though why he should, being what and who he was beyond Rand. But Rand only waited patiently until she caught her breath. For Aiel humor, this was mild, more the sort of thing he would have expected from Mat than from any woman, but mild even so. When she straightened, wiping her eyes, he said, "What of the Shaido, then? Or are there Wise Ones also at this conclave?" She answered, still giggling into her wine. She considered the Shaido finished. Hardly worth considering now. Thousands of prisoners had been taken, with the trickle still being brought in, and the fighting had died down except for a few small skirmishes here and there. Yet the more he got out of her, the less he could see them as done for. With the 4 clans keeping Han occupied, the bulk of Couladin's people had crossed the Galen in good order, even carrying away most of the Carianan prisoners they had captured. Worse, they had destroyed the stone bridges behind them. That did not concern her, but it did him. Tens of thousands of Shido, north of the river, no way to get at them until the bridges were replaced, and even wooden spans would take time. It was time that he did not have. At the very end, when it seemed there was no more to say on the Shido, she told him what made him forget worrying about the Shido, and what trouble they would cause. She just tossed it in, as if she had almost forgotten. Matt killed Couladin? He said incredulously when she was done. Matt! Did I not say so? The words were sharp, but half-hearted. Peering at him over her wine cup, she seemed more interested in how he would take the news than in whether he doubted her word. Asmodean plucked a few chords of something martial. The harp seemed to echo to drums and trumpets. In some ways, a young man of as many surprises as you. I truly look forward to meeting the third of you, this Heron, one day. Rand shook his head. So Matt had not escaped the pull of Taviran to Taviran after all. Or maybe it was the pattern that had caught him, and being Taviran himself. Either way, he suspected Matt was not too happy right that moment. Matt had not learned the lesson that he had. Try to run away, and the pattern pulled you back, often roughly. Run in the direction the wheel wove you, and sometimes you could manage a little control over your life. Sometimes. With luck, maybe more than any expected, at least in the long haul. But he had more urgent matters than Matt or the Shido. A glance at the entrance told him the sun was well up, though all he saw otherwise was 2 maidens squatting just outside, spears across their knees. A night and most of a morning with him unconscious, and Samael had either not tried to find him or had failed. He was careful to use that name, even to himself, though another floated in the back of his mind now. Tel Janin Ilansar. No history recorded the name, no fragment in the library at Tarvalon. Moraine had told him everything the Aes Sedai knew of the Forsaken, and it was little more than was told in village tales. Even Asmodean had always called him Samael, if for a different reason. Long before the War of the Shadow ended, the Forsaken had embraced the names men had given them, as if symbols of rebirth in the Shadow. Asmodean's own true name, Joar Adam Nasosin, made the man flinch, and he claimed to have forgotten the others in the course of 3,000 years. Perhaps there was no real reason to hide what was going on inside his head. Maybe it was only an attempt to deny reality to himself. But Samael the man would remain. And as Samael, he would pay in full for every maiden he had killed. The maidens Rand had not been able to keep safe. Even as he made the resolution, he grimaced. He had made a beginning by sending Wyraman back to Tyr. The White Willing, only he and Wyraman knew how much of one so far. But he could not go chasing off after Samael, whatever he wanted or vowed. Not yet. There were matters to be seen to here in Cairhien first. Aviendha might think he did not understand Giotto, and perhaps he did not. But he understood duty, and he had one to Cairhien. Besides, there were ways to tail it in with Wyraman. Sitting up, and trying not to show the effort of it, he covered himself as decently as he could in the blanket, and wondered where his clothes were. He did not see anything but his boots standing over behind Aviendha. She probably knew. It might have been Gaishain who undressed him, but it could just as easily have been she. I need to go into the city. Natail, have Jadin saddled and brought up. Tomorrow, perhaps, Aviendha told him firmly, catching Asmodean's coat sleeve as he started to rise. Moraine Sedai said you would need to rest for today, Aviendha. Now. I don't know why Mylan isn't here if he's alive, but I mean to find out. Natail, my horse? She put on a stubborn face, but Asmodean jerked his arm free, smoothing the wrinkled velvet, and said, Mylan was here, and others. He was not to be told, Avienda began angrily, then tightened her mouth before finishing, he needs to rest. So, the wise ones thought they could keep things from him. Well, he was not as weak as they believed. He tried to stand, holding the blanket close, and turned the motion into shifting his position when his legs refused to cooperate. Maybe he was as weak as they thought, but he did not intend to let that stop him. I can rest when I'm dead, he said, and wished he had not, when she flinched as if he had hit her. No, she would not have flinched at a blow. His staying alive was important to her for the Aiel's sake, and a threat there could hurt her more than a fist. Tell me about Mylan, Natail. Avienda kept a sullen silence, though if looks had anything to do with it, Asmodean would have been struck dumb as well. A rider had come from Mylan in the night, bearing flowery praises and assurances of undying loyalty. At dawn, Mylan himself appeared, with the 6 other High Lords of Tyr, who were in the city, and a small host of tyrant soldiers who fingered sword hilts and gripped lances, as though more than half expecting to fight the Aiel, who had stood silently watching them ride in. It came close, Asmodean said. This Mylan is not used to being thwarted, I think, and the others scarcely more so, especially the lumpy-faced one, Torion and Simon. That one has eyes as sharp as his nose. You know, I'm used to dangerous company, but these men are as dangerous in their way as any I have known. Avienda sniffed loudly. Whatever they are used to, they had no choice with Soralia and Amis and Bear and Melaine on one side, and Sulin with 1,000 Fargarais Mai on the other. And there were some stone dogs, she conceded, and a few water seekers, and some red shields. If you truly serve the Ka'akan as you claim, Jason Natail, you should guard his rest as they do. It is the dragon reborn I follow, young woman. The Ka'akan I leave to you. Go on, Natail, Rand said impatiently, earning a sniff for himself. She was right concerning the tyrant's choices, though perhaps the maidens and others fingering their veils had concerned them more than the wise ones. In any case, even Aracom, a graying, slender man with a long, smoldering temper, had been near bursting aflame by the time they reined their horses around. And Graham, bald as a stone and wide as a blacksmith, was white-faced in rage. Asmodean was not sure whether it had been the certainty of being overwhelmed that stopped them drawing swords, or the realization that if they somehow managed to cut a path to Rand, he was unlikely to welcome them with his allies' blood on their blades. Mylan's eyes were bulging out of his head, the man finished. But before leaving, he shouted out his allegiance and fealty to you. Perhaps he thought you might hear. The others echoed him quickly, yet Mylan added something that made them stare. I make a gift of Kyrian to the Lord Dragon, he said. Then he announced that he would prepare a grand triumph for you when you are ready to enter the city. There's an old saying in the Two Rivers, Rand said dryly. The louder a man tells you he's honest, the harder you must hold on to your purse. Another said, the fox often offers to give the duck its pond. Kyrian was his without gifts from Mylan. No doubts about the man's loyalty. It would last just as long as Mylan believed he would be destroyed if caught betraying Rand. If caught, that was the hook. Those 7 High Lords in Kyrian had been the most assiduous in trying to see him dead in Tyr. That was why he had sent them here. Had he executed every Tyran noble who plotted against him, there might have been none left. At the time, handing them anarchy, famine, and civil war to deal with 1,000 miles from Tyr had seemed a good way to put a crimp in their schemes, while doing some good where it needed doing. Of course, he had not even known Couladin existed then, much less that the man would lead him to Kyrian. It would be easier if this was a story, he thought. In stories, there were only so many surprises before the hero knew everything he needed. He himself never seemed to know a quarter of everything. Asmodean hesitated. That old saying about shouting men might be applied to him, too, as he was no doubt aware. But when Rand said no more, he added, I think he wants to be king of Cairhien, subject to you, of course. And preferably with me far away. Mylan probably expected Rand to return to Tyr and to Kalandor. Mylan certainly would never be afraid of too much power. Of course. Asmodean sounded even drier than Rand had. There was another visit between those two. A dozen Cairhienan lords and ladies, without retainers, came cloaked and with faces hidden in their hoods despite the heat. Plainly they knew that the Aiel despised Cairhienan, and just as plainly returned the sentiment. Yet they were as nervous that Mylan might discover they had come as that the Aiel might decide to kill them. When they saw me, Asmodean said wryly, half seemed ready to kill me for fear I was Tyrant. You have Farder Asmai to thank that you still have a bard. Few as they were, the Cairhienan had still been harder to turn back than Mylan, growing sweatier and more white-faced by the minute, but stubbornly demanding to see the Lord Dragon. It was a measure of their desire that when demands failed, they finally descended to open begging. Asmodean might have thought Aiel humor odd or harsh, but he chuckled over nobles in silk coats and riding dresses, trying to pretend he was not there as they knelt to catch at the Wise One's woolen skirts. Sorlia threatened to have them stripped and flogged back to the city. His muted laughter turned disbelieving. They actually discussed it among themselves. Had the requirement allowed them to reach you, I do believe some would have accepted. Sorlia should have done it, Avienda put in, surprisingly agreeable. The Oathbreakers have no honor. At last, Mullane had the maidens throw them across their horses like bundles and run the animals from camp, with the Oathbreakers hanging on as they might. Asmodean nodded. But before that, two of them did speak to me, once they were certain I was not a tyrant spy. Lord Dobrain and Lady Colliver. They clouded everything in so many hints and innuendos that I cannot be certain. But I would not be surprised if they mean to offer you the Sun Throne. They could bandy words with some people I used to be acquainted with. Rand barked a laugh. Maybe they will, if they can manage the same terms as Mylan. He had not needed Moraine to tell him that Cairhienan played the game of houses in their sleep, nor Asmodean to tell him they were tried with the Forsaken. The High Lords to the left and the Cairhienan to the right. One battle done, and another, of a different sort, if no less dangerous, beginning. In any case, I mean the Sun Throne for someone who has a right to it. He ignored the speculation on Asmodean's face. Perhaps the man had tried to help him the night before, and perhaps he had not. But he did not trust the fellow enough to let him know half of his plans. However much Asmodean's future might be tied to his loyalty was all necessity, and he was still the same man who had chosen to give his soul to the Shadow. Mylan wants to give me a grand entry when I am ready, does he? So much the better that I see what's what before he expects me. It came to him why Avienda had become so agreeable, even helping the talk along. As long as he sat here talking, he was doing exactly what she wanted. Are you going to get my horse in the tail, or must I? Asmodean's bow was deep, formal, and on the surface at least, sincere. I serve the Lord Dragon. Chapter 46. Other battles, other weapons. Frowning after Asmodean, and wondering how far he trusted the man, Rand was startled when Avienda threw down her cup, splashing wine onto the rugs. Aiel did not waste anything that could be drunk, not only water. Staring at the wet spot, she appeared just as surprised, but only for a moment. The next instant, she had planted fists on hips where she sat and was glaring at him. So, the Carcarn will enter the city when he can barely sit up. I said the Carcarn must be more than other men, but I did not know he was more than mortal. Where are my clothes, Avienda? You are only flesh. My clothes? Remember your toe, Randolphor. If I can remember Giotto, so can you. That seemed a strange thing to say. The sun would rise at midnight before she forgot the smallest scrap of Giotto. If you keep on like this, he said with a smile, I'll begin thinking you care for me. He meant it for a jest. There were only two ways to deal with her, joke or simply override her. Arguing was fatal, and a mild one, considering they had spent a night in each other's arms. But her eyes went wide in outrage, and she jerked at the ivory bracelet as if to pull it off and throw it at him. The Khan is so far above other men that he does not need clothes, she spat. If he wishes to go, let him go in his skin. Must I bring Sorlia and Bear? Or perhaps Enila and Samara and Lamel? He stiffened. Of all the maidens who treated him as a long-lost son of 10, she had chosen the three worst. Lamel even brought him soup. The woman could not cook a lick, but she insisted on making him soup. You bring whoever you wish, he told her in a tight, flat voice. But I am the Khan, and I am going into the city. With luck, he could find his clothes before she returned. Samara was nearly as tall as he, and, at the moment, probably stronger. The one power certainly would do him no good. He could not have embraced Saidin if Samael appeared in front of him, much less held on to it. For a long moment, she met his stare, then abruptly picked up the leopard-worked cup and refilled it from a hammered silver pitcher. If you can find your clothes and dress yourself without falling down, she said calmly, you may go. But I will accompany you, and if I think you are too weak to continue, you will return here if Samara must carry you in her arms. He stared as she stretched out on one elbow, carefully arranged her skirts, and began sipping at her wine. If he mentioned marriage again, no doubt she would snap his head off again. But in some ways, she behaved as if they were married. The worst parts of it, at least. The parts that did not seem a pennyworth different from Enila or Lamel at their worst. Muttering to himself, he gathered the blanket around him and shuffled past her and the fire pit to his boots. Clean woolen stockings were folded up inside, but nothing else. He could summon Guy Shine and have the entire matter spread through the camp, not to mention the possibility that the maidens would get into it after all. Then the question would be whether he was the Khan who must be obeyed, or just Randall Thor, another man entirely in their eyes. A rolled rug at the back of the tent caught his eye. Rugs were always spread out. His sword was inside, the belt with the dragon buckle wrapped around the scabbard. Humming to herself, eyes lidded, Avienda looked half asleep as she watched him search. You no longer need that. She invested the word with so much disgust that no one would have believed she had given him the sword. What do you mean? There were only a few small chests in the tent, inlaid with mother of pearl or worked in brass, or in one case, gold leaf. The Aiel preferred putting things in bundles. Nothing held his clothes. The gold-covered chest, all unfamiliar birds and animals, held tightly tied leather sacks and gave off a smell of spices when he raised the lid. Couladin is dead, Randolph Thor. Startled, he stopped and stared at her. What are you talking about? Would Lan have told her? No one else knew. But why? No one told me, if that is what you are thinking. I know you now, Randolph Thor. I learn you more every day. I wasn't thinking any such thing, he growled. There isn't anything anybody could tell. Irritably, he snatched up the scabbarded sword and carried it awkwardly under his arm as he went on searching. Avienda continued sipping wine. He thought she might be hiding a smile. A fine thing. The High Lords of Tyr sweated when Randolph Thor looked at them, and the Carianan might offer him their throne. The greatest Aiel army the world had ever seen had crossed the Dragon Wall on the orders of the Kar Karn, the chief of chiefs. Nations trembled at the mention of the Dragon Reborn. Nations! And if he did not find his clothes, he would sit waiting on permission to go outside from a lot of women who thought they knew better about everything than he did. He finally found them when he noticed the gold-embroidered cuff of a red coat sleeve sticking out from under Aviendha. She had been sitting on them all along. She grunted sourly when he asked her to move, but she did it, finally. As usual, she watched him shave and dress, channeling the water hot for him without comment, and without being asked. After the third time, he nicked himself and muttered about cold water. In truth, this time he was bothered as much because she might see his unsteadiness as for any other cause. You can become used to anything if it goes on long enough, he thought wryly. She misunderstood his head shaking. Elaine will not mind if I look, Randall Thor. Pausing with the laces of his shirt half done, he stared at her. Do you really believe that? Of course. You belong to her, but she cannot own the sight of you. Laughing silently, he went back to the laces. It was good to be reminded that her newfound mystery hid ignorance, aside from anything else. He could not help smiling smugly as he finished dressing, buckled on his sword, and took up the tasseled Seanchan spearhead. That last turned the smile a touch toward grimness. He had meant it as a reminder that the Seanchan were still in the world, but it served to recall all the things that he must juggle. Garianan and Tyrants, Samael and the other Forsaken, the Shido, and nations that did not know him yet. Nations that would have to before Tarmangaden. Dealing with Aviendha was really quite simple compared with that. Maidens leaped to their feet when he ducked out of the tent quickly to hide the unsteadiness of his legs. He was not sure how far he succeeded. Aviendha kept to his side as though she not only intended to catch him if he fell over, but fully expected him to. It did nothing for his mood when Sulan, in her cap of bandages, looked questioningly at her, not him, her, and waited for her nod before ordering the maidens to be ready to move. Asmodean came riding his mule up the hill, leading Jadin by the reins. Somehow he had found time to don fresh clothes, all dark green silk, with spills of white lace, of course. The gilded harp hung on his back, but he had given up wearing the Gleeman's cloak, and he no longer carried the crimson banner with its ancient symbol of the Aes Sedai. That office fell to a Carianan refugee named Pevin, an expressionless fellow in a patched farmer's coat of rough, dark gray wool, on a brown mule that should have been put out to grass from pulling a cart some years back. A long scar, still red, ran up the side of his narrow face, from jaw to thinning hair. Pevin had lost his wife and sister to the famine, his brother and a son to the Civil War. He had no idea which house's men had killed them, or who they had supported for the Sun Throne. Fleeing toward Andor had cost him a second son at the hands of Andoran soldiers, and a second brother to bandits, and returning had cost the last son, dead on a Shido spear, and his daughter as well, carried off while Pevin was left for dead. The man rarely spoke, but as near as Rand could make out, his beliefs had been winnowed down to a bare three. The dragon had been reborn. The last battle was coming. And if he stayed close to Randall Thor, he would see his family avenged before the world was destroyed. The world would end, surely, but it did not matter. Nothing did, so long as he saw that vengeance. He bowed silently to Rand from his saddle as the mare reached the crest. His face was absolutely blank, but he held the banner straight and steady. Climbing onto Jadin, Rand pulled Aviendha up behind him without letting her use a stirrup, just to show her that he could, and kicked the dapple into motion before she was settled. She flung both arms around his waist, rumbling only partly under her breath. He caught a few more snippets of her current opinion of Randall Thor, and of the Kar Karn, too. She made no move to let go, though, for which he was grateful. Not only was it pleasant having her pressed against his back, the support was welcome. With her halfway to the saddle, he had suddenly not been sure whether she was coming up or he down. He hoped she had not noticed. He hoped that was not why she was holding on to him so tightly. The crimson banner, with its large black and white disc, rippled behind Pepin as they zigzagged down the hill and along the shallow valleys. As usual, the Aiel gave little attention to the party as it passed, though the banner marked his presence as surely as the encircling escort of several hundred Barter Eyes Mai easily keeping pace with Jotun and the mules. They went on about their business among the tents, covering the slopes, at most glancing up at the sound of hooves. It had been startling to hear of nearly 20,000 prisoners taken from Couladin's followers. Until leaving the Two Rivers, he had never really believed so many people could be in one place. But seeing them was twice the shock. In clusters of 40 or 50, they dotted the hillsides like cabbages, men and women alike, sitting naked in the sun, each cluster under the eyes of one guy shine, if that. Certainly no one else paid them much mind, though now and again a cotton sword-clad figure approached one of the groups and ordered a man or woman off on an errand. Whoever was called out went at a run, unguarded, and Rand saw several returning to slip back into their places. For the rest, they sat quietly, almost looking bored, as if they had no reason to be elsewhere, or desire to be either. Perhaps they would put on white robes just as calmly. Yet he could not help remembering how easily these same people had violated their own laws and customs already. Couladin might have begun the violation, or ordered it, but they had followed and obeyed. Frowning at the prisoners, 20,000 and more to come, he would certainly never trust one to hold to Guy Shine. It took some time before he noticed an oddity among the other Aiel. Maidens and Aielmen who carried the spear never wore anything on their heads except the shufa, and never any color that would not fade into rocks and shadows. But now he saw men with a narrow scarlet headband. Perhaps 1 in 4 or 5 had a strip of cloth knotted around his temples, with a disc embroidered or painted above the brows. 2 joined teardrops, black and white. Perhaps most strangely of all, Guy Shine wore it too. Most had their cowls up, but every last bare-headed one wore it. And Algaid Siswai and their cotton sores saw, and did nothing. Whether wearing the headband or not, Guy Shine were never to wear anything that those who could touch weapons did. Never. I do not know, Aviendha said curtly into his back when he asked what it meant. He tried to sit up straighter. She really did seem to be holding him more tightly than necessary. After a moment, she went on, so softly that he had to listen sharp to catch it all. Bear threatened to strike me if I mentioned it again, and Sorlia hit me across the shoulders with a stick. But I think they are those who claim we are Siswayaman. Rand opened his mouth to ask the meaning. He knew a scant few words of the old tongue, no more. When interpretation floated to the surface in his mind. Siswayaman. Literally, the spear of the dragon. Sometimes, Asmodean chuckled, it is difficult to see the difference between oneself and one's enemies. They want to own the world, but it seems you already own a people. Turning his head, Rand stared at him until amusement faded, and, shrugging uncomfortably, he let his mule fall back beside Perrin in the banner. The trouble was that the name did imply, more than implied, ownership. That was out of Luce Theron's memories, too. It did not seem possible to own people, but if it was, he did not want to. All I want is to use them, he thought wryly. I see you don't believe it, he said over his shoulder. None of the maidens had donned the thing. Aviendha hesitated before saying, I don't know what to believe. She spoke as quietly as before, yet she sounded angry and unsure. There are many beliefs, and the wise ones are often silent, as if they do not know the truth. Some say that in following you, we expiate the sin of our ancestors in failing the Aes Sedai. The catch in her voice startled him. He had never considered that she might be as worried as any other Aiel about what he had revealed of their past. Ashamed might be a better word than worried. Shame was an important part of Jiatou. They were ashamed of what they had been, followers of the Way of the Leaf, and at the same time ashamed that they had abandoned their pledge to it. Too many have heard some version of part of the prophecy of Ordiam now, she went on in a more controlled tone. For all the world, as if she had heard a word of that prophecy herself before she began training to become a wise one. But it has been twisted. They know that you will destroy us. The control faltered for the space of one deep breath. But many believe that you will kill us all in endless dances of the spear, a sacrifice to atone for the sin. Others believe the bleakness itself is a testing, to wear away all but the hard core before the last battle. I've even heard some say that the Aiel are now your dream, and that when you awake from this life, we will be no more. A grim set of beliefs that. Bad enough that he had revealed a past they saw as shaming. It was a wonder they had not all left him, or gone mad. What do the wise ones believe? He asked as quietly as she. That what must be will be. We will save what can be saved, Randolph. We do not hope to do more. We. She included herself among the wise ones, just as Egwene and Elaine included themselves in the Aes Sedai. Well, he said lightly, I expect Sorlea at least believes I should have my ears boxed. Probably Bear does too, and certainly Melaine. Among other things, she mumbled. To his disappointment, she pushed away from him, although keeping a hold on his coat. They believe many things I could wish they did not. He grinned in spite of himself. So she did not believe he needed his ears boxed. That was a pleasant change since waking. Adnan Kadir's wagons lay a mile or so from his tent, circled in a broad depression between the hills, stone dogs on watch. A cream-colored coat straining over his bulk, the hatchet friend looked up, mopping his face with a large handkerchief as Rand rode past with his banner. Moraine was there as well, examining the wagon where the door frame rail was lashed under canvas, behind the driver's seat. She did not even glance around until Kadir spoke to her. By his gestures, he was plainly suggesting that she might want to accompany Rand. In fact, he appeared eager for her to go, and small wonder. He had to be congratulating himself on keeping his being a dark friend hidden so long. But the more he was in the company with an Aes Sedai, the more he was in danger of discovery. Indeed, it was a surprise to Rand that the man was still there. At least half of the drivers who entered the waste with him had slipped away since crossing the Dragon Wall, replaced by Kyrian refugees chosen by Rand himself, to make sure they were not of Kadir's sort. He expected every morning to find the fellow himself gone too, especially since Ascendra's escape. The maidens had nearly torn the wagons apart looking for the woman, while Kadir sweated his way through 3 handkerchiefs. Rand would not regret it if Kadir managed to sneak off in the night. The Aiel guards had orders to let him go, so long as he did not try to take Moraine's precious wagons. More obviously every day, their loads were a treasure to her, and Rand would not see her lose them. He glanced over his shoulder, but Asmodean was staring straight ahead, ignoring the wagons altogether. He claimed to have had no contact with Kadir since he captured him, and Rand thought it might be true. Certainly the merchant never left his wagons, and was never out of sight of Aiel guards except when inside his own wagon. Opposite the wagons, Rand half drew rein without thinking. Surely Moraine would want to accompany him into Kyrian. She might have crammed his head full, but it always seemed there was another piece she wanted to fit in. And this once in particular he could do with her presence and advice. But she merely looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to the wagon. Frowning, he heeled the dapple on. As well to remember she had other sheep to shear than he knew about. He had become too trusting. Best to be as wary of her as of Asmodean. trust no one, he thought bleakly. For an instant, he did not know whether it was his thought or Lews Theron's, but in the end he decided it did not matter. Everybody had their own goals, their own desires. Much the best to trust no one completely except himself. Yet he wondered, with another man oozing through the back of his mind, how far he could trust himself. Vultures filled the sky around Carrion in smiling pairs of black wings. On the ground they flapped about among clouds of buzzing flies, squawking hoarsely at glossy ravens that tried to usurp their rights to the dead. Where Aiel went across the treeless hills recovering the bodies of their slain, the birds lumbered aloft fatly, screeching protests, then settled again as soon as the living humans were a few paces gone. Vultures and ravens and flies together could not really have made the sunlight dimmer, yet it seemed so. Stomach twisting, trying not to see, Rand healed Jadden faster until Avienda clung to his back once more and the maidens were running. No one protested, and he did not believe it was only because Aiel could maintain that speed for hours. Even Asmodean looked pale around the eyes. Evan's face never changed, though the bright banner whipping above him appeared a mockery in that place. What lay ahead was little better. Rand remembered the foregate as a raucous beehive, a tangled warren of streets full of noise and color. Now it was a still, thick band of ashes surrounding the square gray walls of Carrion on three sides. Charred timbers lay crazily atop stone foundations, and here and there a soot-black chimney yet stood, sometimes tilting precariously. In places, a chair lying somehow untouched in the dirt street, a hasty bundle dropped by someone fleeing, a rag doll, emphasized the desolation. Breezes stirred some of the banners on the city's towers and along the walls, a dragon standing out red and gold on white at one place, the crescent tier, white on red and gold at another. The middle set of the Jangai gates stood open, three tall square arches in the gray stone, guarded by tyrant soldiers in rimmed helmets. Some were mounted, but most afoot, and the variously colored stripes on their wide sleeves showed they were retainers of several lords. Whatever was known in the city about the battle being won, and Aiel allies coming to the rescue, the approach of 1,000 Farder Eyes Mai created some little stir. Hands went uncertainly to sword hilts, or spears and long shields, or lances. Some of the soldiers half moved as if to close the gates, even while looking to their officer, with 3 white plumes on his helmet, who hesitated, standing in his stirrups and shading his eyes against the sun to study the crimson banner, and more particularly, Rand. Abruptly, the officer sat down, saying something that sent 2 of the mounted tyrants galloping back through the gates. Almost immediately, he was waving the other men aside, calling, "Make way for the Lord Dragon Randall Thor! The light illumine the Lord Dragon! All glory to the Dragon Reborn!" The soldiers still appeared uneasy about the maidens, but they formed into lines to either side of the gates, bowing deeply as they broke through. Avienda sniffed loudly at his back, and again when he laughed. She did not understand, and he had no intention of explaining. What amused him was that however hard Tyrans or Carrienan or anyone else tried to puff up his head, he could rely on her and the maidens, at least, to take the swelling down, and Egwene and Moraine, and Elaine and Nynaeve, for that matter, if he ever saw either again. Come to think of it, a lot of them seemed to make that a large part of their life's work. The city beyond the gates stilled his laughter. Here the streets were paved, some broad enough for a dozen or more large wagons abreast, all straight as knife cuts, crossing at right angles. The hills that rolled outside the walls were here carved and terraced, faced with stone. They looked as much made by men as the stone buildings with their severe straight lines and sharp angles, or the great towers with their unfinished tops, surrounded by scaffolding. People crowded the streets and the alleys, dull-eyed and hollow-cheeked, huddling beneath makeshift lean-tos or ragged blankets rigged as tents, or simply jammed together in the open, the dark clothes favored by Carrion and city dwellers, and the bright colors of foregaters, and the rough garb of farmers and villagers. Even the scaffolds were filled, on every level to the very top, where folk looked tiny for the height. Only the middle of the streets remained clear as Rand and the maidens made their way along, and that only for as long as it took the people to surge out around them. It was the people who stilled his mirth. Worn and ragged as they were, jammed together like sheep in a too small pen, they cheered. He had no idea how they knew who he was, unless perhaps the officer's shouts at the gates had been heard. But a roar sprang ahead of him as he circled through the streets, the maidens forcing their way through the throng. The thunder of it overwhelmed any words except for the occasional Lord Dragon, when enough shouted it together, but the meaning was clear in men and women holding up their children to see him pass, in scarves and scraps of cloth waved from every window, in people who tried to push past the maidens with outstretched hands. They certainly seemed to have no fear of Aiel, not at the chance to lay a finger on Rand's boots, and their numbers were such, the pressure of hundreds shoving them forward, that some managed to wriggle through. Actually, a good many touched Osmodians instead. He certainly looked a lord in all his dripping lace, and perhaps they thought the Lord Dragon must be an older man than the youth in a red coat. But it made no difference. Whoever managed to put a hand to anyone's boot or stirrup, even Pevins, wore joy on their faces and mouthed Lord Dragon into the din, even as maidens forced them back with their bucklers. Between the clamor of acclaim and the riders sent by the officer at the gate, it was no surprise when Mylan appeared. A dozen less Tyrant lords for retinue and 50 defenders of the stone to clear his way, laying about them with the butts of their lances. Gray-haired, hard and lean in his fine silk coat with stripes and cuffs of green satin, the High Lord sat his saddle with the stiff-backed ease of one who had been put on a horse and taught to command it almost as soon as he could walk. He ignored the sweat on his face, and equally the possibility that his escort might trample someone. Both were minor annoyances, and the sweat likely the greater. The Dorian, the pink-cheeked lordling who had come to Ironrod, was among the others, not quite so plump as he had been. So his red-striped coat hung on him. The only other Rand recognized was a broad-shouldered fellow in shades of green. Raimund had liked to play at cards with Mac back in the stone, as he recalled. The others were older men for the most part. None displayed any more consideration of the crowd they plowed through than Mylan. There was not one Carrienan in the lot. The maidens let Mylan ride through, and Rand nodded, but closed behind him to exclude the rest, a fact the High Lord did not notice at first. When he did, his dark eyes smoldered angrily. He was often angry, Mylan was, since Rand had first come to the Stone of Tyr. The noise began to abate with the Tyrant arrival, fading to a dull murmur by the time Mylan made a rigid bow to Rand from his saddle. His gaze flickered to Aviendha before he decided to ignore her, just as he was trying to ignore the maidens. "The light illumine you, my Lord Dragon. Be you welcome to Carrion. I must apologize for the peasants, but I was unaware you meant to enter the city now. Had I known, they would have been cleared. I meant to give you a grand entry befitting the Dragon Reborn." "I have had one," Rand said, and the other man blinked. "As you say, my Lord Dragon," he went on after a moment, his tone making it clear that he did not understand. "If you will accompany me to the royal palace, I have arranged a small greeting. Small indeed, I fear, since I had no warning of you. Yet by this even, I will make sure whatever you have arranged now will do," Rand cut in, and received another bow and a thin, oily smile for reply. The fellow was all subservience now, and in an hour he would be talking as to someone too feeble-witted to understand facts held under his nose. But beneath it all lay a contempt and hatred that he believed Rand did not see, although they shone in his eyes. Contempt because Rand was not a lord, not truly, as Mylan saw it, by birth. And hatred because Mylan had had the power of life and death before Rand came, with few his equal and none his superior. To believe that the prophecies of the dragon would be fulfilled someday was one thing. To have them fulfilled, and his own power diminished by them, was quite another. There was a moment of confusion before Rand made Sulin allow the other Tyrant Lords to bring their horses behind Asmodean and Heaven's banner. Mylan would have had the defenders clear the way again, but Rand curtly ordered that they follow behind the maidens. The soldiers obeyed, faces unchanging beneath the rims of their helmets, though their white-plumed officer shook his head, and the High Lord put on a condescending smile. That smile faded when it became clear that the crowds opened up easily ahead of the maidens. That they did not have to club a path through, he attributed to the Aiel reputation for savagery, and frowned when Rand made no reply. One thing Rand made note of, now that he had Tyrans with him, the cheers did not rise again. The royal palace of Cairhien occupied the highest hill of the city, exactly in the center, square and dark and massive. In fact, between the palace, in all its levels, and the stone-faced terracing, it was hard to say there was a hill there at all. Lofty colonnaded walks and tall, narrow windows, high above the ground, did no more to relieve the rigidity than did gray, stepped towers, precisely placed in concentric squares of increasing height. The street became a long, broad ramp leading up to tall bronze gates, and a huge square courtyard beyond, lined with Tyrant soldiers standing like statues, spears slanted. More stood on the overlooking stone balconies. A ripple of murmurs ran through the ranks at the appearance of the maidens, but it was quickly stilled in chanted shouts of, "All glory to the dragon reborn! All glory to the Lord Dragon and Tyr! All glory to the Lord Dragon and the High Lord Mylan!" From Mylan's expression, you would have thought it all spontaneous. Dark-garbed servants, the first Cairhienin Rand had seen in the palace, rushed out with worked golden bowls and white linen cloths as he swung a leg from the pommel and slid from his saddle. Others came to take reins. He took the excuse of bathing his face and hands in cool water to leave Avienda to climb down by herself. Trying to help her down might have ended with them both flat on the paving stones. Unprompted, Sulin chose out 20 maidens besides herself to accompany him within. On the one hand, he was glad she did not want to keep every last spear around him. On the other hand, he wished Nyla, Lamel, and Samara were not among the 20. The considering looks they gave him, especially Lamel, a lean, strong-jawed woman with dark red hair, nearly 20 years older than he, made him grind his teeth while trying to smile reassuringly. Somehow Avienda must have managed to speak to them, and to Sulin behind his back. I may not be able to do anything about the maidens, he thought grimly as he tossed a linen towel back to one of the serving men. But burn me if there isn't one Aiel woman who'll learn on the Kalarkarn. The other High Lords greeted him at the foot of the broad gray stairs that led up from the courtyard, all in colorful silk coats and satin stripes and silver-worked boots. It was plain that none were where Mylan had gone to meet him until after the fact. Potato-faced Torian, oddly languid for such a lumpy man, sniffed anxiously at a scented handkerchief. Wayam, oiled beard making his head seem even balder, clenched fists the size of small hams, and glared at Mylan, even as he bowed to Rand. Simon's sharp nose seemed to quiver in outrage. Marakan, with blue eyes, rare in Tyr, compressed his thin lips until they almost disappeared. And while Hearn's narrow face was all smiles, he tugged unconsciously at one earlobe as he did when furious. Only blade-slender Arakom showed no outward emotion, but then he almost always kept his anger well-banked until ready to let it burst into flame. It was too good an opportunity to miss. Silently thanking Moraine for her lessons, it was easier to trip a fool than to knock him down, she said. Rand clasped Torian's pudgy hand warmly and clapped Gwayam on the point of a thick shoulder, returned Hearn's smile with one warm enough for a close companion, and nodded silently to Arakom with a seemingly significant glance. Simon and Marakan he all but ignored after one look as flat and cool as a deep winter pond for each. That was all it needed for the moment, beyond watching their eyes shift and faces tighten in thought. They had played Deus de Mar, the game of houses, their entire lives, and being among Carianan, who could read volumes in a raised eyebrow or a cough, had only heightened their sensitivity. Each man knew Rand had no reason to be friendly toward him, but each had to wonder if his own greeting was only to cover something real with someone else. Simon and Marakan appeared the most worried, yet the others eyed those two perhaps the most suspiciously of all. Perhaps his coolness had been the true cover, or maybe that was what they were meant to think. For himself, Rand thought that Moraine would be proud of him, and so would Tom Maryland. Even if none of these 7 was actively plotting against him at the moment, something he did not think even Matt would bet on, men in their positions could do much to disrupt his plans without being seen to, and they would do so from habit, if for no other reason. Or they would have. He had them off balance now. If he could keep them that way, they would be too busy watching each other and too afraid of being watched in turn to trouble him. They might even obey for once without finding 100 reasons why things should be done differently from what he wanted. Well, that might be asking too much. His satisfaction slipped when he saw Asmodean's sardonic grin. Worse was Avienda's wondering stare. She had been in the Stone of Tyr. She knew who these men were, and why he had sent them here. I do what I must, he thought sourly, and wished it did not sound as if he were trying to excuse himself. Inside, he said, more sharply than he intended, and the 7 High Lords jumped as if suddenly recalling who and what he was. They wanted to crowd around him as he climbed the stairs, but except for Mylan to show the way, the maidens simply made a solid circle around him, and the High Lords brought up the rear with Asmodean and the Lesser Lords. Avienda stuck close by, of course, and Sulin was on his other side, Samara and Lamel, and Delilah right behind him. They could have reached out and touched his back without stretching. He gave Avienda an accusing look, and she arched her eyebrows at him so questioningly that he almost believed she had nothing to do with it. Almost. The corridors of the palace were empty except for the dark-liveried servants who bowed almost just to knees or curtsied just as deeply as he passed. But when he entered the Grand Hall of the Sun, he discovered that the Carianan nobility had not been excluded from the palace entirely. "The Dragon Reborn comes," intoned a white-haired man just inside the huge gilded doors, worked with the rising sun. His red coat embroidered with 6-pointed stars in blue, a little large on him after his time in Carian, marked him for an upper servant of Mylan's house. "All hail the Lord Dragon Randall Thor! All glory to the Lord Dragon!" A quick roar filled the chamber to its angle-vaulted ceiling, 50 paces up. "Hail the Lord Dragon Randall Thor! All glory to the Lord Dragon! The light illumine the Lord Dragon!" But the silence that followed seemed twice as still by comparison. Between massive square columns of marble, thick streaked with blue so deep it was almost black, stood more Tyrans than Rand expected. Ranks of lords and ladies of the land dressed in their finest, in peaked velvet hats and coats with puffy striped sleeves, in colorful gowns and lace ruffs and close-fitting caps, intricately embroidered or sewn with pearls or small gems. To their rear were the Carianan, darkly garbed except for slashes of color across the breast of gown or knee-length coat. The more stripes and house colors, the higher the rank of the wearer. But men and women with color from neck to waist or lower stood behind Tyrants clearly of minor houses, with yellow embroidery instead of thread of gold and wool instead of silk. No few of the Carianan men had shaved and powdered the front of their heads. All of the younger men had. The Tyrants looked expectant, if uneasy. The Carianan faces could have been chiseled from ice. There was no way to say who had cheered and who not, but Rand suspected most of those cries had come from the front rows. "A good many wish to serve you here," Mylan murmured as they made their way up the blue-tiled floor with its great golden mosaic of the rising sun. A ripple of silent curtsies and bows followed. Rand only grunted. They wished to serve him. He did not need Moraine to know that these lesser nobles hoped to become greater on estates carved out of Carian. No doubt Mylan and the other 6 had already intimated, if not promised, which lands would be whose. At the far end of the Grand Hall, the Sun Throne itself stood centered atop a wide dais of deep blue marble. Even here, Kyrianan restraint held, for a throne at any rate. The great heavy-armed chair glittered with gilt and golden silk, but somehow it seemed to be all plain in vertical lines, except for the wavy-rayed rising sun that would stand above the head of whoever sat on it. That was meant to be him, Frank realized long before reaching the 9 steps to the dais. Aviendha climbed up with him, and Osmodian, as his bard, was allowed up as well. But Sulin quickly arrayed the other maidens around the dais, their casually held spears blocking Mylan as well as the rest of the High Lords. Frustration painted those tyrant faces. The hall was so quiet that Rand could hear himself breathe. "This belongs to someone else," he said finally. "Besides, I've spent too long in the saddle to welcome such a hard seat. Bring me a comfortable chair." There was a moment of shocked silence before a murmur ran through the hall. Mylan suddenly wore such a look of speculation, quickly suppressed, that Rand nearly laughed. Very likely Osmodian was right about the man. Osmodian himself was eyeing Rand with barely hidden surmise. It was some minutes before the fellow in the star-embroidered coat ran up panting, followed by 2 dark-liveried Kyrianan, carrying a high-backed chair piled with silk-covered cushions, and pointed out where to place it with a great many worried glances at Rand. Vertical lines of gilt ran up the chair's heavy legs and back, but it seemed insignificant in front of the Sun Throne. While the 3 servants were still bowing themselves away, bending double on every step, Rand tossed most of the cushions to one side and sat down gratefully, the Seanchan spearhead on his knee. He was careful not to sigh, though. Aviendha was watching him too carefully for that, and the way Samara kept glancing from her to him and back confirmed his suspicions. But whenever his problems with Aviendha and Father Eyes Eye, most present awaited his words with equal parts eagerness and trepidation. "At least they'll jump when I say toad," he thought. "They might not like it, but they would do it." With Moraine's help, he had worked out what he must do here. Some he had known was right even without her suggestions. It would have been good to have her there to whisper in his ear if needed, instead of Aviendha waiting to signal Samara. But there was no point in waiting. Surely every tyrant and Kyrianan was in his chamber. "Let the Kyrianan hang back," he said loudly, and found himself shifted, exchanging confused glances. "Tyrants came to help, but that is no reason for Kyrianan to hold themselves in the rear here. Let everyone sort themselves by rank. Everyone." It was difficult to say whether Tyrants or Kyrianan were the most stunned, though Mylan looked ready to swallow his tongue, and the other 6 not far behind. Even slow-burning Arakom went white in the face. With much shuffling of boots and twitching aside of skirts, with many icy stares on both sides, it was done, until the front rows were all men and women with stripes across their chests, and the second held only a few Tyrants. Mylan and his fellows had been joined at the foot of the dais by twice their number of Kyrianan lords and ladies, most graying, and everyone stripes from neck nearly to knees, though perhaps joined was not the right word. They stood in 2 groups, with a full 3 paces between, and looked away from one another so hard that they might as well have shaken fists and shouted. Every eye was on Rand, and if the Tyrants were in a fury, the Kyrianan were still ice, hints of a thaw, and considering where they studied him. "I have noticed the banners flying above Kyrian," he went on, once the movement stilled. "It is well that so many of the crescents of Tyr gaze had something of the..."
Chapter 47. The Price of a Ship.
All right, everyone. Okay, call into his life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, gotta stay safe.